The dog stopped barking at the storm and started barking at the mountain itself. Snow blasted sideways across the ridge as Jack dropped to one knee, fighting the wind. Duke lunged toward a spot buried beneath fresh drifts, clawing furiously at the ice-packed ground. Somewhere below them, a faint voice carried through the blizzard. The cold burned Jack's lungs, and the mountain seemed to groan beneath his boots. Then Duke uncovered something that shouldn't have been there. What do you think Duke found? The first thing people noticed was not the paper in Jack Mercer's hand. It was the dog. Duke sat outside the diner door, unmoving despite the cold. Snow drifted across the street in thin white ribbons, collecting on the old German shepherd's dark fur. He didn't shake it off. He didn't pace. He simply sat there, staring toward the Bitterroot Mountains as if he were watching something no one else could see. Inside, the diner was warm, crowded, and loud. The lunch crowd had gathered around the old iron stove near the back wall. Coffee cups clinked. Boots scraped against worn wooden floors. Someone laughed too hard at a joke that wasn't very funny. Jack stood near the counter, a folded ownership paper resting beneath one rough hand. At 57, he looked older than he was, not because of gray hair. Not because of the lines around his eyes. It was the way he carried himself, like a man who never fully stopped expecting bad news. Across from him sat Earl Donnelly, a retired prospector whose luck had disappeared years before his teeth had. Earl pushed the paper across the table. "That's it," he said. $10, and it's yours." Jack studied the document without touching it. The cave sat high above town on the eastern ridge. Most locals called it Goat Hole. Nobody hunted there. Nobody camped there. Nobody wanted it. Walter Briggs leaned back in his chair near the stove and laughed. Only man in Montana dumb enough to buy a cave before winter. Several others joined in. Walter owned the largest supply warehouse in the valley. If people needed flour, lamp oil, salt, or credit, they usually ended up standing in front of Walter sooner or later. His opinion carried weight. Unfortunately, so did his ego. "Tell me something, Jack," Walter said loudly enough for half the diner to hear. "Planning to live underground, like a groundhog?" More laughter. Jack didn't react. That annoyed Walter even more. Most people defended themselves when they were mocked. Jack rarely did. Combat engineers learned early that arguing with noise usually created more noise. He unfolded the paper slowly, read every line, then looked at Earl. Only one question. "How does the air move inside?" The laughter faded for a moment. Earl blinked. "What?" "The draft." Jack folded the paper again. "Does it run deep?" The old prospector scratched his beard. "Actually." His eyes narrowed as he thought. "Yeah, it does." That answer seemed to matter more to Jack than anything else written on the page. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a worn $10 bill. His last one. The bill had been folded so many times the corners looked ready to fall apart. Walter noticed. "So that's really your last 10? Jack glanced at him. Didn't answer. Because it was. The odd jobs had slowed. Winter contracts hadn't started. His savings had disappeared months ago, and yet here he was, buying a cave. Walter shook his head. "That's not a shelter." He pointed toward the paper. "That's a cheap grave." The room erupted again. Jack signed his name, folded the document, slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he walked toward the door. No speech, no defense, no explanation. Just quiet footsteps crossing old wooden floorboards. The bell above the entrance jingled when he stepped outside. The cold hit immediately. Duke rose before Jack said a word. The dog's amber eyes remained fixed on the mountains. Jack followed his gaze. The eastern ridge stood beneath a gray sky. Snow clung to the upper slopes. The wind moved strangely. Not strong. Not yet. But different. He could feel it. The same way he used to feel changes before sandstorms overseas. A shift in pressure. A subtle movement. The world holding its breath. "Come on, buddy." Duke finally looked at him, then fell into step beside him. Neither glanced back toward the diner. Behind them, laughter continued. Ahead of them, the mountains waited. That night, Jack sat alone inside his small rental cabin at the edge of town. The wood stove glowed faintly. The room smelled of smoke and old pine boards. Duke slept near the door, or at least pretended to. Jack hadn't slept yet. The clock showed 2:14 a.m., then 2:46, then 3:31. The wind touched the cabin walls. A soft sound, barely noticeable. Most people would never have heard it. Jack did. His eyes lifted immediately, listening, measuring, tracking, direction. Without realizing it, he counted exits. Front door, kitchen window, back door. Same habit, same routine, years after Iraq. Years after Mosul, years after the explosions. The wind shifted again. Duke raised his head. Jack looked toward the dark window. Somewhere beyond those black hills sat a worthless cave nobody wanted. He listened for another minute, then another. The wind changed direction a third time, and for the first time all day, a faint crease appeared between his brows, because something about it didn't feel right. Outside, snow drifted across the valley. Above town, hidden in darkness, the cave waited. And neither Jack nor Duke knew that before winter was over, people who laughed at that $10 purchase would be begging to get inside. The next morning arrived gray and cold. A thin layer of frost covered the valley. Fence posts stood white along the road. Smoke drifted lazily from a handful of chimneys. Jack was already awake. Not because he had slept well, because he never really had. The coffee on his stove had barely started bubbling when he was pulling on his boots. Duke stood beside the door before Jack reached for his coat. Ready, always ready. An hour later, they were climbing the eastern ridge above town. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The trail was narrow and steep, weaving through pine trees that had survived more winters than anyone in Sawtooth could remember. The cave appeared slowly. Not dramatic, not impressive, just a dark opening cut into a wall of stone. Goat Hole. The name suddenly seemed fitting. Jack stopped several yards away, studied it. The habit came naturally. Observe first, move second. In Iraq, rushing into an unfamiliar structure could get people killed. Years later, the instinct remained. His eyes traveled over the entrance. Rock stability, possible collapse points, drainage patterns, wind direction, nothing unusual. Yet, Duke stepped forward before Jack did. The dog paused at the mouth of the cave, nose working, ears twitching. Then, he disappeared inside. Jack followed. The temperature changed immediately. Outside, the wind moved constantly. Inside, the air felt heavier. Still, the first chamber wasn't much. A low ceiling, damp walls, loose gravel scattered across the floor. The kind of place most people would enter once and immediately leave. Duke ignored it completely. He kept walking. Deeper. The beam from Jack's flashlight followed him through a narrow passage. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. The sound echoed softly. One drop, then another, then silence. The tunnel widened unexpectedly. Jack stepped into a second chamber. Larger, drier, different. He stopped. So did Duke. The dog turned once, twice, then lowered himself onto the stone floor near the eastern wall and stayed there. Jack waited. Normally Duke would keep exploring. Not today. The German shepherd simply stared at him, as if saying, end quote. Here, this spot. Jack crouched beside him. The floor felt dry. Not completely dry, but far drier than the entrance. Interesting. He switched off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed everything. Then he waited, listening. At first he heard nothing, then something subtle. Air. Moving. Not much, just enough. His head turned slightly. The draft wasn't coming from the entrance. It was coming from somewhere deeper. Natural ventilation. His eyes narrowed. Now that he knew what to listen for, he could hear it. A slow breath moving through stone. The cave wasn't sealed. It was alive. Jack stood, moved carefully along the eastern wall. The draft strengthened. Above him, almost invisible in the darkness, a narrow crack climbed toward the ceiling. His flashlight revealed faint black stains surrounding it. Soot. Old soot. Not recent. Very old. For several seconds he simply stared. Someone had built fires here, many fires. The smoke had escaped through that crack. A natural chimney. A smile almost appeared on his face. Almost. Then the wind outside shifted. A sudden howl echoed through the entrance tunnel. The sound hit the chamber. Sharp. Violent. For one terrible second it became something else. Not wind. Incoming. Mosul. Night. Dust. Someone shouting. The whistle of a mortar round crossing black sky. Jack dropped instinctively. one knee hitting stone, heart exploding against his ribs. His hand reached for a weapon that wasn't there. The memory lasted less than a second, but it felt much longer. Duke was beside him immediately. The dog's nose pressed against his arm. Solid. Real. Here. Montana. Not Iraq. Jack exhaled slowly. The cave returned. The darkness returned. The dripping water returned. His pulse took longer. A lot longer. Easy, buddy. Duke remained beside him until his breathing settled. Only then did the dog return to the spot near the eastern wall, the same exact spot. Jack followed his gaze. There had to be a reason. Animals rarely wasted energy, especially working dogs. He walked over, studied the area more carefully. The wall beside Duke carried deeper soot stains. The floor showed faint marks beneath decades of dirt. Not natural marks, human marks. Someone had arranged this space deliberately. A sleeping area. His flashlight swept wider and stopped. Near the back wall, half buried beneath dust, a circle of blackened stones, an old fire ring. Jack approached slowly. The ashes were long gone, but the stones remained. Proof. Someone had survived here. Not for a night, not for a weekend, for an entire winter, maybe several. The realization settled quietly inside him. Outside, people saw a worthless hole in a mountain. Inside, Jack saw shelter, potential, possibility. His flashlight moved one final time and caught something scratched into the stone. 3 lines, then another 3, then another. Dozens of them. Tally marks. Someone had counted days, or weeks, or storms. Jack stared at them for a long moment, then looked toward Duke. The old German shepherd was already lying down again, calm, certain, as if he had known all along. For the first time since buying the cave, Jack felt something he hadn't felt yesterday. Not confidence, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Outside, winter continued gathering strength in the mountains. Inside the cave, hidden beneath decades of dust and silence, the first pieces of a plan were beginning to take shape, and neither Jack nor Duke noticed the fresh snow starting to fall beyond the entrance. By the end of the week, Jack had stopped thinking of the cave as a cave. Now he thought of it as a structure, a system, a place that either worked or failed, the same way a bridge worked, the same way a defensive position worked, the same way every temporary shelter he had built in Iraq either protected people or got them killed. Every morning, before sunrise, he climbed the ridge with Duke. Every evening, they came down carrying less energy and more dirt. The townspeople noticed. So did the jokes. Jack heard them while loading salvaged lumber behind the hardware store. He heard them while buying rope. He heard them while dragging old pallets through town. The mountain man's building a castle. Maybe the dog owns it. Maybe they're both crazy. Jack never responded. Duke didn't either. The dog simply walked beside him, carrying one end of a rope in his mouth. By the second week, the first real changes appeared inside the cave. Jack built a raised sleeping platform from weathered pallets. Cold ground, stole, body heat. That lesson had cost people dearly in places much hotter than Montana. The platform sat nearly a foot above the stone floor. Next came drainage. The old trench running through the chamber had nearly disappeared beneath years of debris. Jack spent an entire day reopening it. Water had to move. If water stopped moving, everything else eventually failed. Duke followed him everywhere, sometimes so closely, Jack nearly tripped over him. Other times, the dog vanished for several minutes into the deeper sections of the cave before returning again, always watching, always listening. One afternoon, Jack was working near the eastern wall when Duke suddenly exploded into barking. Not playful barking, not warning strangers barking, urgent barking, the kind that demanded immediate attention. Jack froze. The shovel stopped moving. Duke stood 20 feet away near a section of rock Jack hadn't examined closely. The German shepherd's ears were forward, his body rigid, barking again. Once, twice, 3 times. Jack immediately set the shovel down. Combat engineers learned something important over the years. If something feels wrong, stop. If a trained dog says something is wrong, stop faster. He approached carefully. The wall looked normal. At first. Then he noticed a thin crack. Hairline. Easy to miss. His flashlight beam followed it upward. The crack widened near the ceiling. Jack's expression changed. Slowly, the stone above carried more weight than he realized. A lot more. If he'd built the sleeping area beneath it, one hard freeze-thaw cycle might have brought part of the ceiling down. Not enough to destroy the cave. Enough to kill somebody. His eyes moved toward Duke. The dog had stopped barking. Now he simply watched, waiting. Jack crouched beside him. "You saved me a hell of a headache." Duke's tail thumped once against the dirt. That evening, Jack relocated the sleeping platform, far away from the unstable section. The next morning, he reinforced the cracked area with support timbers scavenged from an abandoned equipment shed. It wasn't perfect, but it bought safety. And safety bought time. 3 days later, Sarah Mercer drove up the mountain. Jack heard the truck before he saw it. The sound echoed through the trees. Duke reached the entrance first, tail wagging. Sarah climbed out carrying a paper sack. She was 54 now, still carrying the same determined expression she'd worn most of her life. The divorce had happened years ago. The resentment hadn't. Not completely. But neither had the affection. "You look terrible," she said. Jack accepted the paper sack. "Good seeing you too." Inside were sandwiches, coffee, and a small jar of aspirin. Sarah stepped into the cave. Her eyes adjusted slowly. Then she looked around. The platform. The drainage trench. The stacked firewood. The carefully arranged stones. The ventilation crack overhead. The old concern appeared in her face almost immediately. "You're doing it again." Jack knew exactly what she meant. He sat down on a log. "What am I doing?" "Preparing for something that isn't here." Outside, wind moved through the pines. Inside, neither spoke for several seconds. Sarah folded her arms. "You've been sleeping?" Jack took a sip of coffee. Didn't answer. She already knew. "You still wake up every night?" Silence. That was answer enough. Sarah looked away, toward Duke. The dog was lying beside the eastern wall, exactly where he'd chosen on the first day. "You know," she said softly, "not every storm is Iraq." Jack stared into the darkness of the rear chamber. "No." His voice remained calm. "But cold doesn't care where you learn the lesson." Sarah didn't argue. For the first time, she noticed something she hadn't before. The cave felt different. Not warm, not comfortable, but stable. Outside, the wind rose and fell. Inside, the air barely changed. When she finally left, she paused beside her truck. "You coming back down tonight?" Jack looked toward the ridge, then toward the cave, then toward Duke. "No." Sarah sighed, half frustration, half worry. Then she drove away. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, shortly afterward. Darkness settled across the valley. Jack built a small fire inside the old stone ring. Nothing large, just enough to study airflow. The smoke climbed upward, found the crack, disappeared, exactly as he'd hoped. Hours later, long after the fire had burned down, Duke abandoned his usual place near the entrance. Jack noticed immediately. The German shepherd stood, walked across the chamber, then curled up tightly against the eastern wall, the same wall he'd chosen on the first day, the same wall he'd returned to every time. Jack watched him for a long moment. Something about it bothered him. Not because it seemed wrong, because it seemed deliberate. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside the cave, Duke rested his head on his paws and stared toward the darkness, as if listening to something deep within the mountain. And for the first time, Jack began wondering whether the old dog knew something he didn't. The question stayed with him for days. Not because Duke had chosen a different sleeping spot, because Duke never did anything without a reason. The German shepherd had spent years working beside soldiers, years learning to notice things people missed. Scent, pressure, movement, change. The mountain was changing. Jack could feel it too. The first sign appeared 3 mornings later. He was hauling river stones up the ridge when a flock of geese crossed the valley. Nothing unusual about geese, except these birds were flying low, far lower than they should have been. The formation looked broken, uneasy. Jack stopped walking and watched them disappear behind the western hills. Duke watched too. The dog's ears remained forward long after the birds were gone. That afternoon, the temperature climbed nearly 15 degrees. The next morning, it dropped twice as fast. By evening, a thin dusting of powder snow drifted through the air beneath a perfectly clear sky. Jack noticed. Most people wouldn't. Combat engineers learned to pay attention to details because details kept people alive. A bent wire, a disturbed patch of dirt, a missing shadow. The mountain was giving off details now. Tiny ones. But they were adding up. Every day, Duke seemed more restless. He spent less time near the entrance. More time along the eastern wall. Sometimes he would stand motionless for several minutes, head tilted slightly, listening. One evening, Jack found fresh claw marks on the dirt beside Duke's usual spot. The dog had been digging, not much, just enough to expose a section of stone beneath the soil. Jack knelt beside the marks. The rock felt warmer than the surrounding floor. Not warm, just less cold. Interesting. Very interesting. That night he added another note to the small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Wind direction, temperature changes, animal behavior, stone temperatures. The notebook looked less like a handyman's notes and more like a reconnaissance log. Old habits. Some habits never left. The following week, the cave continued to improve. The sleeping platform was finished. The drainage trench worked perfectly. Firewood stacked neatly against the dry wall. Bags of beans, rice, and flour slowly accumulated in sealed containers. Every trip into town brought another joke, another laugh, another comment. Jack ignored all of them. But one afternoon he noticed something different. Emma Briggs, Walter's daughter. She stood outside the hardware store while he loaded supplies into his truck. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't laughing. She was watching Duke. The dog sat in the truck bed facing east, toward the mountains, toward the cave. Toward something only he seemed to understand. That's a lot of food, Emma said quietly. Jack secured another sack. Winter comes every year. Not like this. The words surprised him. He looked at her. Emma immediately seemed to regret saying them. What do you mean? She shrugged. My dad's been buying extra inventory. Jack paused. That caught his attention. Walter Briggs wasn't a generous man, but he wasn't careless either. If Walter was stockpiling, it meant he saw something. Or expected something. Efter. Before Jack could ask another question, Emma glanced toward the warehouse and stepped away. The conversation ended there, but it stayed in his mind. That night, the wind arrived after midnight. Not strong. Not yet. Just enough to make the pine trees whisper outside the cave. Jack sat beside a small fire reviewing his notebook. Duke slept against the eastern wall. The flames crackled softly. The mountain breathed around them. Then it happened. A sharp metallic bang exploded somewhere outside. Jack hit the ground before he even realized he had moved. The notebook flew from his hand. His shoulder slammed against stone. His pulse instantly accelerated. The firelight vanished from his awareness. The cave vanished. For one brief moment, he wasn't in Montana. He was back in Iraq. Dust, darkness, incoming fire. Someone shouting. Contact left. Someone screaming for a medic. His heart pounded, hard, fast, violent. Duke was already beside him. The dog's nose pressed against his cheek, solid, present, real. Jack blinked. The cave slowly returned. The fire, the shadows, the smell of wood smoke. His breathing took longer, several minutes longer. Outside, the metallic noise came again. This time he recognized it. A dead pine branch swinging against an old metal sign near the trail. Nothing more. Nothing dangerous. The branch struck again. Clang, clang, clang. Jack sat up slowly. The adrenaline lingered. His hands trembled slightly. He stared into the fire. Duke never left his side. Eventually, Jack reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. You always know first, don't you? Duke looked toward the entrance, not toward Jack. Toward the wind. Toward the darkness outside, toward the mountains. Jack followed his gaze. The old feeling returned, the one he'd been carrying for weeks now. The sense that something was coming, something bigger than early snow, something bigger than a cold season. The next morning he made a decision. He closed the notebook, loaded supplies into the truck, and headed toward town. If the signs meant what he thought they meant, people needed to hear it, even if they laughed, especially if they laughed. Because Jack Mercer had seen enough disasters in his life to know one simple truth. The people who ignored warnings were usually the ones who needed rescuing later. And before the week was over, he was about to stand inside the diner and give Sawtooth Hollow a warning nobody wanted to hear. The parking lot was full when Jack arrived. Pickup trucks lined the street. A delivery trailer sat outside Walter Briggs's warehouse. People were preparing for winter. Just not enough. Jack noticed it immediately. Half-filled wood racks, uncovered firewood, loose shingles, poorly sealed windows, the kind of details most people ignored until the first serious storm arrived. Duke jumped from the truck before Jack opened his own door. The old German shepherd landed softly and immediately lifted his nose into the air. The wind shifted. Again. Jack noticed. So did Duke. Neither liked it. The bell above the diner door jingled when they entered. Conversation continued for a few seconds, then slowed, then stopped. Not because people disliked Jack. Most of them respected him. What made them uncomfortable was the possibility that he might be right. Jack walked past the counter, past the stove, past the same table where he had bought the cave. Duke stayed beside him, calm, silent, watching. Ben Carter sat near the window, with a coffee mug in one hand. The local carpenter had shoulders like an ox and a laugh people could hear across town. "What brings the mountain man down?" Ben asked. A few people chuckled. Jack remained standing. He didn't remove his coat, didn't order coffee, didn't sit. That alone made several people uneasy. He looked around the room. Faces he had known for years. Ranchers, mechanics, retirees, young couples, people raising children, people planning Christmas, people assuming winter would behave like every other year. It'd be smart to reinforce your roofs. The room grew quieter. "Double your firewood if you can." Someone exchanged a glance with someone else. Jack continued. "Seal drafts now." Ben leaned back. "That bad?" Jack nodded once. "I think so." Walter Briggs laughed, loudly. The tension broke immediately. "Based on what?" Several heads turned. Walter smiled. "Your dog?" More laughter followed. Jack wasn't surprised. He had expected it. Still, something about hearing it out loud irritated him. Not because they mocked him, because they weren't listening. "The birds are moving differently." Walter rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go. The pressure keeps dropping. The pressure always drops before winter. The wind's changing directions too fast." Walter spread his hands. "And the cave told you that?" Another round of laughter. Even Ben smiled. Jack's jaw tightened, only slightly. Years ago, during his second deployment, an older sergeant had taught him something important. You can give people information. You can't force them to use it. His eyes moved toward the window, toward the gray sky beyond town, toward clouds gathering over the mountains. Then, he said the only thing he came to say. "Get ready before Friday." The room fell silent again. Not because they believed him, because of how serious he sounded. Ben finally broke the silence. "You expecting the end of the world?" "No." Jack looked toward the northern ridge. "I'm expecting weather." The answer wasn't dramatic. That somehow made it worse. Nobody laughed this time. Not immediately. Then Walter shook his head. "There it is." He raised his coffee cup. A toast. Several people groaned. Walter ignored them. "To Jack Mercer." More people looked uncomfortable now. "Owner of the finest $10 cave in Montana." A few laughs returned. Not many. Emma Briggs sat alone near the back. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't watching Jack. She was watching Duke. The dog stood perfectly still beside the door. Not looking at food. Not looking at people. Not looking at movement. Looking outside. Toward the mountains. Toward something far beyond the diner. Emma noticed it. So did Jack. A strange feeling settled into his stomach. The same feeling he'd had before sandstorms, before mortar attacks, before situations went bad. Not fear, recognition. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. Every head turned, just for a second. Then conversation resumed. The moment passed. Jack knew it hadn't really passed. He pulled on his gloves. That's all. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed him. The bell rang again as he stepped outside. The cold felt sharper now, the sky darker. Duke jumped into the truck without being told. The drive back up the mountain was quiet. Halfway there, snow began falling. Not much, just a few flakes, but they were unusually dry. Powder, fine as dust. Jack noticed. He always noticed. The cave appeared as daylight faded. Inside, everything felt stable. The fire burned low. Supplies remained organized. The air moved exactly as it should. For the first time all day, Jack relaxed slightly. Duke didn't. The German shepherd stood near the entrance. watching, listening. Hours passed. Night settled across the mountain. The fire crackled softly. Then something changed. Jack noticed it first, through the lantern. The flame tilted sideways, not flickering, leaning. As if pushed by an invisible hand, he frowned. The cave was sealed. No draft touched the lantern. Yet the flame continued bending. Duke stood immediately. Every muscle in his body tightened. Unquote. The dog moved toward the eastern wall, toward his spot, toward the place he'd chosen from the beginning. Jack stared at the lantern, then at Duke, then at the ceiling. The pressure in the cave felt different, subtle, but undeniable. Outside, the wind began rising. Far away across the dark mountains, something enormous was gathering strength. And for the first time since buying the cave, Jack realized he might not have much time left to prepare. The change arrived 2 days later. Not with snow. Not at first, with pressure. Jack felt it before sunrise. He woke instantly. No nightmare. No sound. Just a sensation. The same strange awareness that had pulled him awake countless times overseas. The cave felt different. The air felt heavier. Duke was already standing. The old German shepherd faced the entrance. Ears high, body rigid, waiting. Jack checked his watch. 4:17 a.m. Outside, the world was silent. Too silent. He stepped into the darkness beyond the cave. The mountains stood beneath a sky, the color of worn steel. No stars. No moon. Only thick clouds gathering over the northern horizon. The wind was gone. Completely gone. Jack didn't like that. Not one bit. Storms announced themselves. The dangerous ones often started with silence. By noon, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. By 3 o'clock, every bird had disappeared. The forest felt abandoned. Even the ravens were gone. Jack spent the afternoon making final adjustments. Extra firewood near the sleeping platform. Water buckets filled. Canvas barriers checked twice. Ventilation inspected. Food counted, then counted again. Duke followed him everywhere. The dog never settled. Never rested. The closer evening came, the more restless he became. At sunset, Jack stepped outside one final time. The valley below looked strangely beautiful. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lights glowed in windows. People moved through town unaware of what was coming. For a moment, he thought about driving down there again. Trying one last time, trying to warn them, but he already knew how that conversation would end. So he stayed. Night arrived. The first sound came shortly after dark. A distant roar. Low, deep, almost impossible to identify. Jack froze. Duke immediately moved beside him. The sound grew louder. Not thunder, not machinery. Wind. An enormous amount of wind. The first gust struck the mountain minutes later. The cave trembled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The outer canvas barrier snapped violently. Then came another gust, stronger, then another. The storm had arrived. Jack moved quickly. Years of training took over. No panic, no wasted movement. He secured the secondary canvas layer. Checked the fire. Inspected the ventilation crack. Confirmed every critical point. The cave responded exactly as he hoped. Stable, controlled, predictable. Outside, the world was becoming none of those things. By midnight, visibility had vanished. Snow finally appeared, not falling downward, moving sideways, driven by winds powerful enough to erase the trail leading to town within minutes. The mountain disappeared. The trees disappeared. Everything disappeared. Only white remained. Jack sat beside the fire listening. The storm sounded alive. Every few seconds another blast slammed into the ridge. The canvas barriers snapped like rifle shots. Whip, crack, whip, crack. The sounds echoed through the cave. Most people would hear fabric. Jack heard something else. For a brief moment, the sharp reports became distant gunfire. A convoy route outside Mosul. Dust storms. Contact reports over the radio. He closed his eyes. The memory tried pulling him backward. Duke stopped it. The German shepherd pushed his head beneath Jack's hand. Solid. Warm. Present. Jack exhaled slowly. The cave returned. The fire returned. The storm returned. Outside, a violent gust slammed into the entrance, hard enough to shake loose gravel from the ceiling. Jack stood immediately, flashlight in hand. Inspection. Always inspect. He moved through the chamber. checking supports, checking airflow, checking for water intrusion. Everything held. The old cave absorbed the punishment. The mountain itself seemed to shield them. Near dawn, Duke suddenly moved. Fast. He left the fire, crossed the chamber, positioned himself directly beside the entrance barrier, then sat down, motionless, watching. Jack frowned. Something had changed. He listened carefully. At first, all he heard was wind. Then, underneath the wind, something else. A faint sound, almost impossible to hear. Gone. Then back again. Jack stepped closer. The noise disappeared beneath another gust. He waited, listened. Nothing. Maybe imagination. Maybe not. Duke remained fixed on the entrance. The dog refused to move. Hours passed. The storm intensified. By afternoon, the valley below had vanished completely beneath blowing snow. Jack climbed onto a rock ledge near the entrance and looked out through a narrow gap. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Roofs. Several roofs were already damaged. One barn had partially collapsed. A trail of debris moved across the valley floor. The storm wasn't weakening. It was growing, and that frightened him. Because the cave still felt comfortable. The fire burned steadily. The air remained dry. The temperature barely changed. If conditions inside the cave were this manageable, while the storm was escalating outside, then the people down in town were already facing something far worse than they realized. Jack climbed down. The realization settled heavily inside him. The warning had come too late. Or maybe nobody had wanted to hear it. Across the chamber, Duke remained near the entrance, watching, listening, waiting. As darkness returned for the second night, the old German shepherd suddenly stood. His ears snapped forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Then, without warning, he lunged toward the entrance. Jack was on his feet instantly, because whatever Duke had heard beyond that wall of wind and snow, it wasn't the storm. The German shepherd hit the entrance barrier so fast that Jack nearly lost sight of him. Duke! The command vanished beneath the roar outside. The dog barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Then again. Jack grabbed his coat and flashlight. Every instinct screamed the same thing. Someone was out there. The outer canvas snapped violently as he pulled it aside. The storm struck him like a wall. Wind stole his breath instantly. Snow blasted across his face hard enough to sting. Visibility couldn't have been more than 15 feet. The world beyond the cave had disappeared. No trail, no trees, no sky, only white. Duke pushed forward anyway. His nose stayed low, tracking. The old working dog moved with purpose, not wandering, not searching randomly, following something. Jack followed close behind, one hand gripping a guide rope anchored to the cave entrance, the other shielding his face from the snow. Step by step, the mountain vanished around them. Several times the wind shoved Jack sideways. Each gust felt strong enough to throw him down the slope. Then Duke stopped. The bark that followed sounded different. Not warning, not alert. Found. Jack dropped to one knee beside him. At first, he saw nothing. Then his flashlight beam caught a shape buried beneath drifting snow. A gloved hand, motionless, half covered. His pulse jumped. Jesus. Jack immediately began digging. Snow packed into every gap. The wind filled holes almost as fast as he cleared them. Within seconds, he uncovered a coat, then a shoulder, then a face. Ruth Holloway, the widow from the south end of town, 72 years old, stubborn as a fence post, and nearly frozen. Her eyelashes were coated with ice. Her lips had lost most of their color. She wasn't unconscious, not completely. But she was close, very close. Duke immediately started licking her face. The old woman barely reacted. "We're getting you out of here!" Jack slipped an arm beneath her shoulders. The effort nearly pulled him off balance. Ruth wasn't heavy. The storm was. Every step uphill felt like dragging weight through deep water. Twice the wind nearly knocked all three of them over. Twice Duke circled back to stay beside Ruth instead of running ahead, refusing to leave her. By the time they reached the cave entrance, Jack's lungs burned. His legs shook. The storm howled behind them. But inside the cave, the world changed immediately. Warmth, stillness, shelter. Jack moved fast. Not panicked, focused. The way training demanded. Wet clothing came off first, not all at once, carefully. layer by layer. He wrapped Ruth in dry blankets, placed warm stones near her feet, started heating water. Not hot. Warm. Too much heat too quickly could make things worse. Duke never left her side. The German shepherd lay against her blanket, sharing body heat, sharing presence. Hours passed. The storm continued raging outside. Inside, the cave remained steady. The fire crackled softly. Water simmered. Snowmelt dripped into buckets. And little by little, Ruth returned. First came movement, a twitch of her fingers, then a blink, then another. Finally, her eyes opened, confused, disoriented, alive. For several seconds, she simply stared at the stone ceiling above her. Then she looked toward Jack, toward the fire, toward the shelves, the wood, the water, the warmth, everything. Her gaze finally settled on Duke. The old dog lifted his head. Ruth smiled weakly. "You found me." Duke's tail thumped once against the ground. Jack handed her a cup. "Easy." She wrapped both hands around it. The warmth seemed to surprise her. Outside, the storm struck the mountain again. A deep roar rolled across the ridge. Ruth flinched, then looked around the cave one more time. Slowly, carefully, as if seeing something nobody else had. When she finally spoke, her voice barely rose above the fire. "You didn't build a shelter." Jack looked up. The old widow rested one trembling hand against the stone wall beside her. The rock still held warmth from the fire. Steady, reliable, safe. Her eyes filled with something that looked very close to wonder. "You built winter's stomach under the mountain." The words hung in the air. Jack didn't answer, because part of him understood exactly what she meant. The cave wasn't fighting the storm. It was digesting it, absorbing it, surviving it. And, hours later, darkness settled over the mountain again. Ruth slept beside the fire. Duke remained nearby, watching. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it sounded stronger. Jack sat near the entrance counting supplies. Beans, rice, flour, firewood, water. Numbers mattered now. Every number mattered. Then Duke lifted his head. Instantly. The movement caught Jack's attention. The dog's ears pointed toward the entrance, listening. Outside, the wind continued screaming. Yet somehow Duke heard something beneath it. Another sound. Faint, distant, human. Jack slowly stood. His eyes moved toward the entrance barrier. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then he heard it too. A muffled noise, almost swallowed by the storm. Almost, but not completely. A voice. Or maybe several. Somewhere beyond the snow. Somewhere beyond the darkness. And suddenly Jack realized Ruth would not be the last person searching for the cave. The sound came again. Faint, barely audible beneath the storm. A voice. Then, another. Duke was already moving. The German shepherd stood at the entrance with every muscle tight, listening through layers of wind and snow that no human ear could have sorted through. Jack grabbed the guide rope. Ruth lifted her head from the blankets. "Someone else?" Jack nodded once. The answer arrived moments later. 3 desperate knocks struck the timber support outside the entrance. Not loud, not strong, just enough. Jack pulled back the canvas barrier. The storm immediately shoved snow into the chamber. 2 figures stumbled inside. One nearly collapsed. The other caught him before he hit the ground. Ben, Carter, and his son, Tommy. For a second, nobody spoke. Ben looked completely different from the man who had laughed inside the diner. Snow covered his beard. Ice hung from his jacket. His eyes looked exhausted. Tommy shivered uncontrollably beside him. The boy couldn't have been older than 12. His cheeks were pale. His breathing sounded wrong. Too fast. Too shallow. Ben removed his gloves with trembling hands. "I didn't know where else to go." The words seemed painful for him to say. Jack simply stepped aside. "Get him near the fire." No lecture, no reminder, no satisfaction, just action. Ben guided Tommy toward the sleeping platform. The boy nearly fell twice. Duke met them halfway. Tommy reached for the dog instinctively. Duke immediately pressed against him. The extra warmth seemed to help. Only a little, but enough. The next several hours disappeared into work. Tommy wasn't freezing. That wasn't the problem. The boy was sick. His cough sounded deep. Every few minutes it rattled through his chest. Jack heated water. Ruth prepared blankets. Ben barely left his son's side. Outside, the storm continued hammering the mountain. Inside, another problem slowly appeared. Space. The cave suddenly felt smaller. Not because it had changed, because people had arrived. Real people. People who needed warmth, needed food, needed hope. Near midnight, another knock came. Then another. A young couple from the western edge of town. Their roof had partially collapsed. 2 hours later, Sarah Mercer arrived with an elderly neighbor whose chimney had iced shut. By dawn, the chamber held 7 people. 7. The fire burned steadily in the center. Shadows moved across the stone walls. Blankets covered every available corner. Jack sat beside the entrance counting supplies again. Beans, rice, flour, water, wood. The numbers looked different now, very different. He didn't mention it. Not yet. Across the chamber, Sarah watched him. She knew that expression. Years ago, she had seen the same look before difficult missions. Jack was calculating, planning, adjusting, searching for solutions before problems became emergencies. Tommy's coughing suddenly worsened. Ben was beside him instantly. The carpenter looked terrified, not visibly, not dramatically. But his hands told the truth. They never stopped moving, adjusting blankets, checking Tommy's forehead, touching his shoulder, again and again and again. Duke quietly climbed onto the sleeping platform. The German shepherd settled beside the boy. Tommy wrapped an arm around the dog's neck almost immediately. The coughing eased. Not because of medicine, because fear had eased. For the first time since arriving, Tommy fell asleep. Ben stared at the scene for a long moment. The firelight reflected in his eyes. Finally, he looked toward Jack. "I should have listened." The words barely rose above the crackling fire. Jack continued feeding wood into the flames. Neither man looked directly at the other. The silence stretched. Then, Ben laughed once. A short, bitter sound. Funny thing is, his eyes remained fixed on Tommy. "I laughed louder than anybody." Jack shrugged. The storm didn't care. Ben lowered his head. That answer somehow hurt more. Outside, another blast of wind struck the mountain. The cave barely noticed. Inside, people slept, or tried to. Sarah rested near the rear wall. Ruth sat awake, knitting with trembling fingers. The young couple shared a blanket. Tommy slept beside Duke. For a brief moment, peace settled over the chamber. Then a sharp cracking sound echoed from somewhere overhead. Everyone froze. The noise came again. Stone, moving. Tiny fragments of dust drifted from the ceiling. Jack was on his feet instantly. Years of training took over before conscious thought. Flashlight, observation, assessment. The crack came from the northern side of the chamber, not the area Duke had warned him about weeks earlier. Another section, smaller, but active. The storm was putting pressure on the mountain. The cave remained safe. For now. Still, the sound changed the room immediately. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone thought the same thing. The cave that had saved them might have limits. Jack swept the flashlight across the ceiling. Dust continued falling, very slowly, very lightly. Not enough to panic. Enough to worry. Across the room, Duke stood up. The German shepherd stared toward the damaged section. Watching, listening, the same way he always did before trouble arrived. And as the storm screamed outside, and the crowded cave settled into uneasy silence, Jack realized something else. The people arriving now weren't strangers anymore. They were his responsibility. And the storm wasn't finished with any of them yet. The 4th day began with silence, not outside. The storm still screamed across the mountain. Inside, people had stopped talking as much. Fear changed the sound of a room. The first night had been full of questions. The second night brought stories. By the 4th day, people mostly listened. To the wind, to the fire, to their own thoughts. Jack noticed everything. The way food portions disappeared faster. The way people stared at the shelves. The way Ben checked on Tommy every 10 minutes. The way Sarah watched the ceiling whenever the mountain groaned. The storm had trapped them together. Now the cave had become more than a shelter. It was a system, and every system had limits. That morning, Jack was inspecting the northern section of the chamber when he noticed something new. Fresh dust. Not much, just enough. He crouched beside the wall and ran 2 fingers across the ground. Fine gray powder coated his skin. The crack overhead had widened. only slightly, but enough. Duke appeared beside him, immediately. The dog stared upward, ears forward, body tense. Jack didn't like that, not at all. He spent most of the morning reinforcing the area with spare lumber. The work kept his hands busy. Busy hands meant fewer memories. Fewer memories meant fewer problems. For a while, it worked. Then a sharp sound echoed through the chamber. A single crack. Jack froze. The noise came from above. Every instinct immediately activated. Assessment. Location. Threat. Response. Years disappeared. The cave became something else. A damaged structure. A danger zone. An unstable position. His heart accelerated. Not from panic. From training. Everybody move away from the north wall. The command came out sharper than intended. Nobody argued. People listened immediately now. That alone felt strange. The storm had done what words couldn't. It had made believers. Tommy was the last to move. The boy had been sitting beside Duke near the edge of the sleeping area. He stood slowly, weak from days of illness. Ben started toward him. Then it happened. The sound wasn't loud. Not at first. More like a deep grinding noise. Stone against stone, the mountain shifting. Everyone looked up. A section of rock above the northern wall fractured. The crack raced across the ceiling. Dust exploded downward. Someone screamed. Jack moved instantly. So did Duke. The German Shepherd reached Tommy first. The boy froze. For one terrible second, he simply stood there, too surprised to move, too scared to react. The falling stone didn't care. A chunk the size of a suitcase broke free. Jack lunged forward, but he was too far away. Duke wasn't. The dog slammed into Tommy's side with every ounce of strength left in his aging body. The impact sent the boy tumbling clear. See, Duke. A fraction of a second later, the stone crashed down. The sound thundered through the cave. Dust filled the air. People shouted. The fire scattered sparks. Then everything stopped. Silence. For one horrible moment, nobody moved. Jack's eyes found Tommy first. Alive. Shaken. Crying, but alive. Relief lasted less than a second, because Duke hadn't gotten completely clear. The German Shepherd struggled to stand, then collapsed again. A low whine escaped him. Jack was beside him instantly. The dog's right shoulder was bleeding, not heavily, but enough. A jagged edge of stone had clipped him during the fall. Duke. The word barely left his mouth. The old dog tried wagging his tail. Even now. Even hurt. The gesture nearly broke something inside Jack. For a moment, the cave disappeared. The fire disappeared. The storm disappeared. Another memory took their place. A dusty road outside Mosul. An armored vehicle. Smoke. The sharp smell of explosives. Specialist Ryan Keller, lying on the ground after an IED strike. Jack kneeling beside him. Trying. Failing. The medic arriving too late. The guilt afterward. The endless replay. The questions. What if I'd seen it sooner? What if I'd reacted faster? What if? The memory lasted only seconds, but it hit hard. Sarah noticed immediately. The way Jack's expression changed. The way his jaw locked. The way his eyes lost focus for a moment. Then Duke nudged his hand. The cave returned. The present returned. The dog was still here. Still breathing. Still alive. Jack exhaled slowly, then went to work. Clean cloth, warm water, pressure, inspection. The wound looked painful, but not catastrophic. No broken bone, no deep penetration. Luck, pure luck. Duke endured the treatment without complaint. Only once did he flinch. Tommy knelt nearby. Tears streaked through the dust on his face. You saved me. The boy's voice cracked. Duke simply rested his head on the blanket. Ben stood behind his son, speechless. The carpenter looked at Jack, then at Duke, then back at his son. No words seemed big enough. Eventually he lowered himself beside the dog. One rough hand settled gently on Duke's neck. Thank you. The whisper barely carried beyond the fire, but everyone heard it. Hours later, the storm continued outside. Inside, the cave felt different. Not weaker, stronger, because everyone now understood exactly what Duke had done. The old German Shepherd hadn't just warned them, he had chosen. And when the mountain demanded a price, he had paid it himself. That evening, Jack refused to sleep. He sat beside Duke's bedroll, watching, listening, waiting, the same way he once watched wounded soldiers through long nights overseas. The fire burned low. The cave remained quiet. Then, deep into the night, Duke suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the entrance. A few seconds later, came 3 slow knocks. Not desperate, not panicked. Careful, measured. Jack stood immediately. Outside, the storm still raged. Nobody should have been out there. Nobody. Yet someone was. And when Jack opened the entrance barrier, he found a young woman standing in the snow, carrying a heavy sack across one shoulder. Emma Briggs. And she wasn't alone. She was carrying a secret that would change everything. For a moment, Jack barely recognized her. Emma Briggs stood in the entrance, wrapped in layers of snow-covered clothing. Frost clung to her hair. One side of her face had turned red from the cold. Across her shoulder hung a heavy canvas sack. Behind her, the storm howled like a living thing. Jack pulled her inside. The canvas barrier dropped shut behind them. Instantly, the cave swallowed the noise. Not completely, just enough. Emma nearly stumbled. Sarah caught her arm before she fell. "Sit down." Emma shook her head. No. She lowered the sack onto the stone floor. The sound alone drew everyone's attention. Heavy. Very heavy. Jack untied the rope. Inside were supplies. Flour, dried beans, salt, rendered fat, medicine. The cave fell silent. Nobody said a word. For several seconds, people simply stared. Because they all understood the same thing. Nobody in town had access to that much food anymore. Not during the storm. Not now. Emma stared into the fire. Her hands trembled. Not from cold, from something else. "What happened?" Sarah asked quietly. Emma swallowed. "My father found out." The answer confused several people. Then she continued. "He caught me taking supplies." Nobody moved. Even the fire seemed quieter. Emma's eyes remained fixed on the flames. "He told me if I walked out the door with food." Her voice cracked slightly. "I shouldn't come back." The words settled heavily over the room. Across the chamber, Ben lowered his eyes. Ruth stopped knitting. Tommy looked confused. Jack watched Emma carefully. Years of military service had taught him how people looked when they were hiding information. Emma wasn't hiding anything. She was carrying it, like a weight, like a burden she could no longer hold alone. "How much does he have?" Jack asked. Emma laughed once, a bitter sound. Then she looked up. "A lot." "A lot." Nobody spoke. "A lot how?" Sarah finally asked. Emma hesitated, then answered. "Enough, Sarah." The silence deepened. The storm continued roaring beyond the stone walls. Inside, people waited. Emma drew a slow breath. "My father reinforced the warehouse weeks ago." Jack already suspected that. Still, hearing it confirmed something unpleasant. "He stocked extra flour." She paused. "Extra beans." Another pause. "Salt pork, oil, firewood." The list continued. Each item made the room heavier. Tommy looked toward Ben. Ben stared into the fire. Ruth quietly removed her glasses. Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to, because they already knew where this conversation was heading. Emma's voice softened. He knew the storm was going to be bad. The words landed like falling stone. Jack felt it immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. The clues suddenly aligned. The extra inventory. The unusual purchases. The hurried repairs to the warehouse. Walter Briggs had seen the signs. Maybe not all of them. Enough of them. And he had prepared. Just not for anyone else. Sarah spoke first. "He knew?" Emma nodded. "Not exactly." She wiped moisture from her cheek. "He didn't know this." Her hand gestured toward the storm outside. "But he knew something was coming." The fire crackled softly. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. Emma continued. "He kept telling people to buy more supplies." Ben finally lifted his head. "I couldn't afford more supplies." Emma looked at him. Neither anger nor judgment appeared in her expression. Only sadness. "I know." The room returned to silence. Then she delivered the part that truly changed everything. "He's still selling." Jack's eyes narrowed. Emma nodded. "To people willing to sign debt papers." The words hung there, cold, sharp, unavoidable. Ruth slowly shook her head. Ben looked away. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Outside, another blast of wind struck the mountain. Inside, disappointment settled across the cave, like another layer of snow. Because greed felt different during a storm. In good times, it was irritating. In bad times, it became dangerous. Jack said nothing. For a long while, he simply stared into the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes. Memories surfaced. Not Iraq, not war, something simpler. A lesson from an old sergeant years ago. Character doesn't appear during hard times. It gets revealed. Across the chamber, Duke lifted his head. The old German shepherd remained injured, his shoulder bandaged, his movements slower, yet his eyes never stopped watching. Emma finally noticed him. The dog's gaze met hers. For some reason, that almost broke her. He always knew. Nobody understood. She laughed softly through tears. Every time I saw him in town, he was looking toward those mountains. Her eyes moved toward Jack. Maybe he knew before all of us. Tommy reached over and gently scratched behind Duke's ears. The dog's tail moved once. Only once. Enough. Hours passed. People drifted toward sleep. The storm remained. The fire remained. The cave remained. Jack did one final inventory before midnight. The numbers weren't good. Not anymore. More people meant more food. More food meant fewer days. He studied the shelves, the remaining flour, the beans, the salt. Then he quietly made the calculation. 2 days. Maybe 3. Not more. The realization stayed with him long after everyone else had fallen asleep. Sarah eventually noticed. Bad? Jack looked toward the shelves, then toward the sleeping families, then toward Duke. The old dog had fallen asleep beside Tommy, despite his injury. Jack lowered his voice. If the storm keeps going, Sarah waited. He stared into the fire for another moment, then finally said it. We run out. Outside, the wind screamed across the mountain. Inside, nobody heard those words except Sarah. But for the first time since the storm began, Jack realized survival was no longer their only enemy. Time was running out too. The storm lasted 2 more days. Then something changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. The wind simply sounded tired. Jack noticed it first during the early hours of the morning. He was awake, as usual. The fire had burned low. Most of the cave slept. Duke rested beside Tommy, his injured shoulder wrapped in fresh bandages. The old German shepherd lifted his head, listening. The mountain had been screaming for nearly a week. Now it seemed to be whispering. Jack stood and walked toward the entrance. The canvas barrier moved gently instead of snapping like gunfire. Outside, the roar had become a distant moan. The storm was dying. By midday, pale sunlight filtered through the clouds for the first time in days. People gathered near the entrance. Nobody rushed outside. After so long trapped beneath stone, the world beyond felt uncertain. Then Tommy stepped through the opening first. His boots immediately sank into snow nearly up to his knees. The boy stumbled, then laughed. A real laugh. The sound froze everyone. For days they had heard only wind, coughing, and worry. Now there was laughter. Simple, unexpected, human. Ruth wiped her eyes. Ben looked away. Even Sarah smiled. One by one, they emerged from the cave. The valley looked unrecognizable. Snow-buried fences. Barn roofs had collapsed. Roads vanished beneath white drifts. Entire sections of town seemed swallowed by winter. The storm had not passed over Sawtooth Hollow. It had passed through it and left its mark. Jack stood beside Duke and surveyed the valley. Years of military experience taught him how to read damage. He didn't need to walk through town to understand what had happened. He already knew. The cave had survived. Many structures below had not. The trip back took most of the day. People moved slowly through deep snow. Neighbors helped neighbors. Nobody traveled alone. Duke limped beside Jack the entire way. His shoulder still hurt, yet he refused assistance. The dog had always been stubborn. The town grew quieter as they approached. Not because nobody was there, because everyone was looking at the same building, Walter Briggs's warehouse. The structure still stood. More than that, it stood almost untouched. The roof remained intact. The walls remained solid. Snow had been cleared from pressure points before the storm. Additional supports reinforced the interior. The preparations were obvious now. Walter had seen danger coming. He had simply prepared for himself. People gathered outside. Ben Carter arrived first, then Ruth, then Sarah, then others. Soon nearly half the town stood in the snow, staring at the warehouse. Nobody shouted, nobody threatened. The silence felt heavier than anger. Walter eventually emerged from the building. His coat looked expensive. His boots looked dry. For the first time since Jack had known him, Walter appeared uncertain. His eyes moved across the crowd, then settled on Emma, standing beside Jack, not beside him. That seemed to hurt more than anything. Emma. His voice carried across the snow. She didn't move. Walter swallowed. The crowd remained silent. Finally, he turned toward Jack. "They don't understand." Jack said nothing. Walter continued anyway. "I protected what belonged to me." No one answered. "I built this business." Still silence. The warehouse stood behind him like a monument. Flour, beans, salt, oil. Enough supplies to help dozens of families. Enough supplies to save people who had nearly frozen. The evidence surrounded him. No explanation could change it. Walter's shoulders sagged. For the first time, he seemed smaller. Not physically, morally. Ben stepped forward. His son stood beside him. Tommy's hand rested on Duke's neck. "You let children freeze." Walter opened his mouth. No words came. Ruth looked toward the warehouse, then toward the people who had survived in the cave. The comparison said everything. Finally, Walter looked at Jack, almost pleading, almost searching for understanding. Jack held his gaze. The valley grew quiet. Even the wind seemed to wait. Then Jack spoke. His voice remained calm, steady, controlled. The same voice people had ignored inside the diner. "You protected inventory." I, Walter flinched. Jack's eyes moved briefly toward the town, toward damaged homes, toward families still digging out, toward children who were alive because they had climbed a mountain. Then he looked back. Not people. Nobody spoke after that. They didn't need to. The judgment had already been delivered. Not by Jack, not by the town, by choices. Walter stood alone in front of a warehouse full of supplies. Emma remained beside the people he had refused to help. That image would stay with Sawtooth Hollow for years. As the crowd slowly dispersed, something unexpected happened. Several people stopped beside Jack. Then more. Then more. "Thank you." A nod. A handshake. A quiet word. Nothing dramatic. Just gratitude. The kind that carried weight because it didn't need volume. Near sunset, Ben approached one final time. Tommy and Duke stood together nearby. The dog leaned gently against the boy. Neither seemed eager to separate. Ben glanced toward the mountain, then toward Jack. "We should name that cave after you." Several others nearby nodded immediately. The suggestion spread faster than Jack expected. Mercer Hollow. Jack didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he looked toward Duke. The old German shepherd sat in the snow, watching children throw snowballs across the street. For the first time in days, the dog looked peaceful. And for some reason, Jack already knew what his answer would be. Spring arrived slowly in the Bitterroot Mountains. Not all at once. One drip at a time. Snow melted from the pines. Ice loosened its grip on fence posts. Mud returned to roads that had disappeared beneath winter for months. The storm became a story. Then a memory. Then something people spoke about in quieter voices. But the cave remained. Every week someone climbed the ridge, sometimes carrying lumber, sometimes carrying supplies, sometimes carrying nothing except gratitude. The mountain path that had once led to a joke now led to a place everyone respected. Jack spent most mornings there, not because he needed shelter anymore, because there was work to do. The cave had changed. Additional shelves lined the walls. Emergency blankets filled storage bins. Barrels of water sat near the entrance. Firewood remained stacked beneath weatherproof coverings. Families contributed what they could. A sack of beans, a box of matches, a coil of rope. Nobody wanted to face another winter unprepared. Not after what they had lived through. The biggest surprise came from the children. They loved the cave. Every afternoon, groups of them raced up the trail. Their laughter echoed through chambers that had once known only silence. And Duke was always waiting. The old German shepherd's shoulder healed slowly. The scar remained, a pale line beneath dark fur. The limp never completely disappeared. Neither did his enthusiasm. Tommy Carter became his shadow. Where one went, the other usually followed. Ben often joked that he'd lost a son and gained a dog. Nobody disagreed. One warm afternoon, nearly 4 months after the storm ended, most of Sawtooth Hollow gathered near the cave entrance. Tables had been set up outside. Food covered them. Children ran between adults carrying ribbons and decorations. Someone had even brought a guitar. The mood felt different than it had in years. Lighter, healthier. The town had survived, and survival had changed it. Jack stood near the entrance, watching the crowd. Sarah joined him. "You know they're still planning to name it after you." Jack smiled slightly. "That's their mistake." Sarah laughed. "You're impossible." "Maybe." But he had already made up his mind. A short ceremony began just before sunset. Nothing formal, nothing fancy, just neighbors standing together. Ben Carter stepped forward first. The carpenter cleared his throat. A wooden sign rested beneath a cloth covering. Several people applauded. Others cheered. Tommy looked excited enough to explode. Ben pointed toward the sign. "We all agreed on something." The crowd nodded. "We wanted to honor the man who saved this town." More applause followed. Jack immediately shook his head. "No." The crowd laughed. Ben laughed too. "We knew you'd say that." The cloth came off. Painted across the sign were 2 words. Mercer, Hollow. The applause grew louder. Jack looked at it for several seconds, then looked toward Duke. The dog lay beneath a nearby pine tree surrounded by children. One little girl was attempting to place a flower crown on his head. Duke tolerated the entire operation with remarkable patience. The sight made Jack smile, a real smile. The kind people rarely saw. Then he stepped forward. The crowd quieted. "You're naming the wrong hero." Silence settled. Jack pointed toward the dog. Every head turned. Duke looked up, confused. The flower crown slipped sideways. Several children giggled. Jack continued. When the cave was empty, his voice remained calm. He found the safest place inside. Tommy nodded immediately. When the ceiling started failing, Ben lowered his eyes. "He warned me." Ruth smiled softly. When the storm hit, Jack paused. "He found people." And the old widow's eyes filled with tears. And when a child needed saving, Tommy reached down and wrapped both arms around Duke's neck. The crowd became very quiet. The dog simply sat there, unaware that everyone was talking about him. Jack looked back at the sign, then at Ben, then at the crowd. It shouldn't be Mercer Hollow, nobody argued. Because deep down, they all knew he was right. Ben slowly nodded. "So, what should it be?" Jack looked toward Duke one final time. The German shepherd stood beneath the fading sunlight, older now, scarred, tired, still watching everyone, still protecting everyone, just as he always had. Jack smiled. Ranger Hollow. For a second, nobody moved. Then Tommy grinned. Sarah laughed. Ruth clapped first. Others followed. Within moments, the entire crowd was applauding again. This time, louder than before. By sunset, a new sign stood outside the cave. Ranger Hollow. The name felt right. The mountains seemed to approve. Long after everyone else left, Jack walked alone into the deepest chamber. The lantern in his hand cast soft light across familiar stone walls. The old tally marks remained exactly where he had first discovered them. Weeks, months, winters survived by people long gone. Jack stood there quietly, then removed a small knife from his pocket. One careful motion, one new mark. The scrape echoed softly through the chamber. Behind him, footsteps approached. Sarah. She stopped beside him. Just one? Jack studied the wall. Outside, faint laughter drifted into the cave. Children, Tommy, neighbors, life. Duke barked once somewhere near the entrance. A happy bark, not a warning, not a signal. Just happiness. Jack listened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled. A small smile, the kind that arrived after years of being lost. The first mark was about surviving winter. Sarah waited. Jack looked toward the sunlight spilling into the entrance, toward the sound of people who cared about one another, toward a dog who had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. Then he quietly said the words he never thought he would. For the first time in a long time. His eyes softened. I'm not preparing to survive anymore. Outside, Duke trotted across the grass with children chasing behind him. The old dog looked warm, for reasons that had nothing to do with fire. Jack watched the sunlight reach deeper into the cave. Then he finished the thought. I'm finally living. Beyond the mountain, spring continued unfolding beneath a clear Montana sky. And beneath the stone, Ranger Hollow breathed quietly on. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If you believe Duke was the true hero of this story, leave a simple 1-inch in the comments. If you think Jack and Duke saved each other, leave a 2. And if this story touched your heart, let us know where you're watching from. Your comments help keep these stories alive, and I read as many of them as I can. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about veterans, loyal dogs, survival, second chances, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another unforgettable story waiting for you in the next video. Until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and never underestimate the loyalty of a good dog. See you in the next story.